Welcome to Primetime at the BU Library. It's good to see you all here. Primetime celebrates the learning beyond the classroom of Bethel faculty, students, and staff, and is a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. If you enjoy the Primetime programming, please consider becoming a member of the Friends of the Library. You can find more information about the Friends as well as archived recordings of past Primetime presentations on the library's website. This week, later on Thursday, May 3rd, at this same time, join us again for the library's 6th annual poetry celebration. Always a delightful time to listen to students, staff, and faculty reading and performing their favorite poetry. And today we're welcoming Dr. Jason Steffenhagen, Associate Campus Pastor, and Senior Graphic Design Major Ben McKeown, as they talk about how interfaith relationships impact our growing understanding of faith ownership and inform who we are becoming. Thank you for being here. Let's welcome them.
Well, thank you. It's a real honor and privilege to get to do this. As was mentioned, my name is Jason Steffenhagen, Associate Campus Pastor. I also, one of the unique roles I get to have is I get to sit on the Interfaith Committee with a few of our faculty colleagues and staff colleagues, and have a really good time trying to figure out how we're going to continue with interfaith initiatives on campus with our colleagues, with staff, with faculty, and then also with students. And so one of the pieces of that was to integrate my understanding and my background in faith development theory and research with what we know about interfaith relationships and stories. And so one of the things that, in trying to put this together, the way that I was thinking about and conceptualizing it is that we could give a whole lot of theory in different ways, and I could probably say this book would come in handy for that. Nice little advertisement for you there, Sarah. But the bigger, I think, underlying truth is that the stories are what shape us. The theories are good, and we're going to dive into faith development theory and identity development theory a little bit as we kind of prepare to hear stories. But the stories are really what change us and move us, and I think one of the ways that we allow stories to really shape us as well is through different expressions of those stories. And so that led me to Ben, because I was going on a walk one day with a student for a meeting, and we happened to go down to the art department, and I saw this display on the wall, and it was Ben's senior art project about identity and who he is and how the world sees him and how he sees himself, and obviously he'll talk more about it. But I thought, oh, this is perfect, because his experiences in life have led him to this place and these relationships that he's had. So we're going to kind of do a little bit of a unique thing. It's not just going to be all theory. It's going to be both theory and some stories. So for those of you that know me, you know that my background is in studying faith development theory, namely Fowler. And then with identity development theory, I really appreciate the work of Marcia, both of them coming from kind of an Ericksonian background with like stage development and that kind of thing. And so I'm going to do a little bit of a recap of Fowler's stages of faith, and then we're going to dive a little bit into Marcia. So if you've heard me talk about this before, forgive me for the review of this, but if you've never heard this before, hopefully this will be an intriguing kind of first step in faith development theory. So James Fowler, back in the early 80s, wrote his book, Stages of Faith, and in that he proposed a 6-stage process of faith development. And that first stage is the intuitive projective stage. This is like from 2 to 6 years old, where you're a little kid, everything's wonderful, everything's real, all the way from the Avengers, Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, Grandma and Grandpa, Mom and Dad, Jesus, Daniel in the Lion's Den, Noah's Ark. All of it seems fantastic, all of it seems real, and so you just go for it. And little kids, they don't have the ability to tell what's real and what's not real. They just appreciate anything they see, anything that sounds like it's going to be cool in a way. Concrete operational thought kicks in at some point in the little kid's life, and they realize, oh man, I need some evidence for what's real. So suddenly, the Easter Bunny doesn't bring a basket, or the Tooth Fairy failed to bring money, and Dad slipped in about 6 o'clock, and they noticed it was Dad, or they woke up one day at Christmas time and they realized, I don't know how Santa Claus is going to get down a non-existent chimney and actually deliver presents, right? And so then they start to ask questions about their faith, and they start to wonder, are the stories of Scripture true? Because sometimes the stories in Scripture sound just as fantastical as the stories we have around Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny or the Tooth Fairy. So when we talk about somebody surviving a lion's den, or we talk about the world being destroyed by a flood, or we talk about somebody walking on water, our minds can't help but ask, is this really true? Is this really real? And so we need to come up with some good explanations for it. And so this is when kids start to get really creative with their faith, and they start explaining away all these things. And I don't mean explaining it away, they explain why it actually is true. So my son, he likes to come up with ideas around why certain stories in the Bible are true. So maybe it's, how did Jesus walk on water? Well, there's a little lizard that's called a Jesus lizard because it runs really fast. So maybe Jesus was faster than Usain Bolt, and he just got to the boat really fast. And at some level I could easily just kind of shame him and be like, no, that's stupid. Like, Jesus wasn't that fast. Well, maybe he was, but that's not the point. But shaming him at the age of 8 isn't helpful for his faith development, because what he's trying to do is engage the story of Scripture. And so even if he's coming up with a fantastical idea, the best thing I can do is say, ooh, that sounds really intriguing. Tell me more about that. Or, do you really think that was necessary? What other reason could Jesus have the ability to walk on water? Let's talk more about that. And so instead of it being a negative, we can turn it into a positive and dive deeper into the story. Well, as kids get a little bit older, this mythic kind of literal stage that they're in, it's a naive stage, as we can all tell. Like, if you're trying to come up with a literal reason for everything within the Bible, you're eventually going to fall short, because a 12-year-old mind can't rationalize it all. They're 12. And so what they end up doing is realizing, I can't figure all this out. Who around me does have it all figured out? And so then they look to the external people in their life. They look to mom and dad. They look to grandma and grandpa. They look to church. They look to school. They look to their friends. They might look to celebrities. So this is kind of the rise of Twitter culture, the rise of Instagram. You see people that are just following wholeheartedly these celebrities or these entertainers, and everything they say on something, they consider it, they weigh it, and maybe they even adopt it, right? To get really relevant, this is why Kanye West this week has had such a controversial week, because people hang on every word Kanye West says, and suddenly he comes out in support of Trump, and there's an entire group of followers of Kanye West that are like, do we still want to follow Kanye West? Because we might not agree with his politics all of a sudden. And so now they're having to wrestle with this, about this external influence that is shaping their worldview. Maybe it's not what they want their worldview to be. And maybe some of them are just saying, well, if Kanye says it, it must be true. And maybe they're just going for it. And so at this stage, usually in our teenage years, we have an externally driven faith, where it's shaped by the people around us, the institutions around us, the culture around us, maybe even our ethnic background, the places that we grow up. And it gives shape to our worldview. This is the time where we have the big questions answered. How did we get here? What's the meaning of life? What happens when we die? Who's got the story that answers those questions? Now, for many of us, we come from kind of spheres of influence that are pretty aligned. They're fairly in agreement. So mom and dad are saying something really similar to grandma and grandpa. They're saying something really similar to what the youth pastor says, or what the Sunday school teacher says, which says something fairly close to what the school may be teaching. And it also has something really similar to say with the youth group that we're in. And then the entertainers that we enjoy, that our parents approve of, are saying something similar. So instead of maybe listening to Kanye, our parents are pushing Hillsong United or something, which happens to align value-wise. And so suddenly this sphere of influence that we have is all fairly homogenous and fairly kind of accurate with each other. And so we can kind of create this little bubble, right? From bubble to bridge, as the book so aptly puts it. So we create this bubble, this sphere, where we kind of are defining who we are, defining our faith, defining our identity. Well, what happens, according to Fowler, is that those external influences, through either times of personal crisis or tragedy, through times of disequilibrium, through new external influences that challenge the ones that we currently have, we end up having some tension, some disequilibrium, some crisis. And that forces us to then reevaluate how we've answered those big questions. So a lot of this happens at college, and there's a few professors in the room, and you've probably sat and had those moments where you're sharing an idea and suddenly you watch all these little light bulbs start to flicker really fast, and you don't know if they're coming on or turning off or what's going on, but you know you're rubbing up against something, and you're pushing on a worldview, you're pushing on an identity, and you're watching this happen right in front of you. And then maybe they come talk to you after class, and it's like, no one has ever put it that way before. And that's a beautiful moment, but it can also be a really scary moment for a student. So the individuative reflective stage is when we take the crisis, whether it's tragedy in our life, things that have happened to us that we've caused, or it's the tension that we've experienced in relationships or in other external influences, and we start to own it for ourselves. We start to ask the hard questions, like, what do I actually think? And then it's not just what do I actually think, but the better question is, why do I actually think it, right? So we move from a what do I think to a why do I think that, or why do I believe that question. And so that's hopefully a healthy move for most of our students. Hopefully they're doing that. They're asking the big why question. I think what can often happen, and we see this at times here at Bethel, is that people are coming to us in typically this third stage, maybe even the second stage, but typically the third stage. And then when they're exposed to the difference, exposed to the new or the challenging, what can sometimes happen is they can do one of two things. They can either just fully adopt the new teaching. So you might see someone that had this beautiful sphere that they grew up with, they loved it, they appreciated it, but now, you know, this professor is saying something totally different, but they have a PhD, or they seem to be really convinced and really convincing, and so the student just goes, you know, I don't agree with my family anymore. I actually agree with this person. And instead of actually owning anything, they've now just switched allegiances. And they've just shifted their focus from one external influence to another. And what's even more impactful about that switching of allegiance is when you also have a shifting of an entire sphere. So it's a professor, it's another professor, it's a campus pastor, and it's a group of roommates. And then it's a new church in the area here at Bethel. And now they've created a new sphere of influence. And they've done a little bit of critical work on their own, but ultimately they're just aligning themselves in a new area. The other thing that can happen is that when they hear difference and they hear new and they hear this crisis, this disequilibrium, is they can just retreat back to what they've always known. That is clearly wrong, and I'm going to hunker down and I'm going to reread what I've already read. And I'm going to dive deeper into these beliefs. You might see this with the age-old Bethel controversy over Calvinism, Arminianism, and open theism. So they get exposed to difference, and instead of evaluating and really processing, you might see somebody go, no, I'm going to go back and I'm going to reread everything, and I'm going to re-listen to every sermon on this topic so that I can create my really solid argument around this, so that I can defend the truth. And so instead of growing and learning and taking ownership, there's a kind of a hunkering down a little bit. Now, the part of this individuative reflective stage that can be a little bit scary is that it creates a second naivete, according to Fowler, where a person, instead of having a benevolent view of their individual and internally driven answers to the big questions, they end up having kind of a prideful way of talking about it, where it's like, I've figured out the answer to the question, not an answer to the question, but the answer to the question. And because they've been exposed to this and this and this, they've thought about it, they've internalized it, they've figured out their answer, but now it's the answer. I always caution my shift leaders for our first year discipleship program, because a lot of them are in the midst of figuring out their identity, figuring out their worldview, and they're applying for leadership because they feel confident, they feel passionate, but what they can do is walk onto a freshman floor as sophomores or juniors, and they have just gotten done with a lecture in class and they feel really good about what they heard, and they go, all right, everybody, I figured it out, and I'm here to tell you which form of God's foreknowledge is the right one. And they've read 2 books and watched 1 YouTube video, and now they've solved the 2,000-year-old conundrum of God's foreknowledge, right? And so there's this naivete that you actually can figure out the path. And so for me, I think that stage 4, a lot like the other stages, is a transitional stage. It's not a stage to just end at. It's not a stage to just kind of go, all right, I've got my stuff, I'm good. Because what often happens is that once you do that, you actually slide back into stage 3. Once you say, okay, I'm good, I know what I believe, you're just going to find a group of people that are just like you that are going to reinforce that. And so you're going to slide back. Instead, what we want is people to continue to think and to grow and to build relationships and to engage new experiences so that hopefully they can move to the conjunctive stage. The conjunctive stage, and all of these get a little bit more confusing because we don't always have the best examples of people in these. And so the conjunctive stage is where we recognize that there's commonality within our stories, regardless of where we, what tradition we come from, what faith background we come from, what denomination we come from, what life experiences, that there are some major themes of human development that we share, and we can still get to love or justice or hope or faith, but it might have looked different. So instead of having the path, we recognize that I'm on a path, I'm on a journey, but somebody else is also on a journey, and their journey has also led them to a place of recognizing that justice is better than marginalization, that love is better than judgment, that mercy and hope are better than despair. And so we come to these and we can say, even though I might not agree with all the steps in your path, or even the theology behind your path, I can honor that your path and my path have honored the cause of love and have honored the cause of civility. And together we can work alongside each other because we're honoring the journey that each other is on. And that's more of the conjunctive, is recognizing that the different paths and the different forms of the journey can lead us to healthy places and healthy reasons to be connected. The last stage is universalizing. And this is where you move past it being, in a way, a theory of respecting the other's journey, but now it's an embodiment of the journey, where you are the manifestation of the thing you represent. You are love. You are justice. You are hope. So universalizing for Fowler is kind of reserved for some of those people in our history where we would say, you would say their name and instantly it would be connected to this identifier. So I would say Dr. King and we would say justice. You would say Mother Teresa and we would say sacrifice. You would say Dietrich Bonhoeffer and you would say hope, or you would say sacrifice again. So these people are embodying the very things that they stand for, even to the cost of their own life or their own place in the world. So this is a little bit of Fowler stage, but this third and fourth areas of the stage theory, this is where I want to bring in identity development theory, because I think Marcia's identity development theory can help us understand how this transition can actually take place and what some of the values are that are needed. So James Marcia came up with this identity development model, and the 2 big factors in it that help us get to a place of owning our identity are the idea of commitment and crisis. That we have to have a high level of commitment and a high level of crisis in order to arrive at a place of ownership in our identity. So when we have a low sense of crisis or a low sense of commitment, so think of commitment like your values, your relationships, that sphere of influence. If you don't have a very solid one, and you don't really have a ton of crisis in your life, you're just kind of existing. You're just kind of eating food, sleeping, trying to figure out what to do with your life. It's a lot like an undecided major. No, I'm just kidding. But you're just trying to figure it out. You don't really know where you're going to place your energy yet. And you also don't have anything forcing you to place your energy somewhere. You're not like rubbing up against a tragedy. You're not rubbing up against disequilibrium to the point of having to make a commitment. But when we do make a commitment, and we make a strong one, we often can move into a place of foreclosure. And foreclosure, I kind of see seamlessly with that stage 3. So we have a high level of relationships, high level of influence, high level of values, commitments to something, but you haven't really pushed it or tested it, or it hasn't really rubbed up against a lot of difference. And so we can come across fairly foreclosed. fairly homogenous about what we believe. A lot of passion, a lot of beautiful evangelism can be done there, but there's a sense of foreclosure because you really haven't messed with it too much. But when we do mess with things, when crisis comes, disequilibrium, tragedy, those kind of things, we can move. It causes us to maybe waver on our commitments. We start to go, oh, I don't really know what I think about all this anymore. And so our commitments and our values, maybe even the relationships waver. Like maybe we don't call home as much because we don't want to be told once again that we're suddenly becoming more and more like so-and-so and not like mom and dad thought we should be. And so maybe the relationship wanes a little bit. And we end up going, oh man, I don't have as solid relationships. I don't have as strong commitments. I don't have as strong values as I once did. And I got all this happening in my life, and I don't really know what I think anymore. And there's a lot of questions that happen in moratorium. But when we continue journeying, and we continue reevaluating, asking the hard questions, and engaging, we can move into a place of achievement. I also like the word ownership here. And so when we are in the midst of the crisis or the disequilibrium, the tension, and we stay committed to the values, the relationships, the pieces of our life that bring meaning, we can actually get to a place of saying, okay, this is who I am, this is what I believe, this is what I value, this is how I'm going to move forward and find my place in the world. So this is, again, Marcia's identity development model. I think a lot of our students can come to us here. I think a large majority come to us here. I think we push them oftentimes here. And I think we need to be helping them get to a place of ownership. The challenge, though, is how do we understand crisis? Because crisis is a scary word sometimes. My wife, in writing my dissertation on this stuff, she was like, you use the word crisis all the time. And she's like, I don't know if it's the best word. I was like, it's not my word, it's Marcia's. So I just kind of fell back on the sword on that one. But I think a better way of maybe understanding crisis is by kind of filling in some other synonymous words in a way, like tension, disequilibrium, doubt, critical thinking. So we need to have a high level of that. So it's not all tragedy or suffering. Those can be forms of crisis, but it can also be like exposure to new ideas. Maybe it's building relationships with people from backgrounds or traditions that you don't come from. And those can cause critical thinking, maybe even cause some disequilibrium or doubt. So when that happens, and those can happen in interfaith relationships. I think it's probably one of the better places to engage and to keep a high level of tension in our lives. So when we have these relationships, we recognize that there are different faiths and there are similar questions that these faiths are asking. So they're asking, what is the meaning of life? What happens when a person dies? Why is there evil in the world? I was reading an article from the Catholic Observer, and it was talking about interfaith relationships, and the Pope was addressing this. And they brought together a bunch of people from different faith traditions, and the Pope very just clearly said, we're all asking similar questions. And by coming together, we can ask them again, and we can re-engage the things that we've all been engaging in, and that's asking the hard questions of why we're here, what's the goal of all of this, where are we moving toward, how are we becoming a better humanity. So if we recognize the commonality of people from different faith traditions, we then can start to see how interfaith relationships can be a benefit to our growing sense of self and our own understanding of our own faith. So interfaith relationships can encourage all people to re-engage those important questions, as we just talked about. I'm going to tell a couple quick stories because, like I said, this is not just about the theory, but more about we want to tell some stories. So a few years ago, I was on an airplane and I was reading a book called The Secret Message of Jesus. And this woman sitting next to me, and I know some of us on an airplane like to talk, some of us don't, most of us don't. So I'm sitting there reading my book, enjoying myself, and this woman says, so what's the secret? And I was like, well, that's a weird question. And then she just goes, I was like, what are you talking about? She goes, well, your book. And I was like, oh, my book, great. Here we go, right? And so, I kind of said, oh, here's the theme of the book. And she was like, oh, interesting. I was like, okay, do I just leave it at interesting, or do we go anywhere with this? So I decided, let's just see what happens. So I said, well, tell me your story. What's your background with stuff like this? Do you have one? And she's like, well, actually, I grew up in the church, but it really hurt me. And I got scarred by people in the church. And the woman was a lesbian, and her partner lived in New York together, far away from where she grew up. And she didn't say that was the reason why the church didn't support her or why she was hurt by the church. I could only imagine that had a role to play. But we started this long conversation. We ended up talking for the entire 2.5-hour flight, and then we went and grabbed lunch together in the airport where we were both waiting to transition to our next airplane. And I think I walked her to her gate, or she walked me to mine. We just had this really great conversation. But what it forced me to do was not simply ask questions about, like, how can I combat atheism or agnosticism. What it forced me to do was say, do I actually know my Bible and know the Christian story well enough to make it moving? Like, is this a good story? Like, why doesn't this story still resonate with her? And what was really fascinating is, as we were kind of unpacking a little bit of her story and the Jesus story, I said, you know, you sound like someone who's a closet fan of Jesus. And she goes, no one's ever put it that way, but yeah, I think I really am. Like, I like him a lot, I just don't like the church. And I was like, well, on behalf of the church, I am sorry. And she was like, no one's ever apologized from the church either. That was kind of weird. And so that kind of initiated this long conversation we got to have. So interfaith relationships with people outside of our faith tradition, help us to re-engage the important questions. I kept her email address in my inbox for about 8 years because it was always this reminder to ask myself, are you engaging in the story? Do you believe this story? And it forced me into staying engaged in the important questions. Interfaith relationships provide opportunities for personal ownership in one's faith tradition, as we just talked about. And part of the research for this, I wasn't just looking for theory, but I was looking for stories. And I was reading a blog of a Muslim woman, and she was talking about interfaith relationships with Jewish people and with Christians. And I thought one of the most interesting pieces that she said was that her conversations with Jewish people and with Christians didn't lead her to exploring the Hebrew scriptures or the Bible, but it encouraged her to dive back into the Quran. And I was like, I think that's true for a lot of us. That when we have conversations with people from other faith traditions, it's not that we're suddenly dying to know everything that this other holy book may say, but instead, it forces us to reevaluate our understanding of our own scriptures, to dive back in and make sure that we feel that we know this book well. Dr. Ibu Patel was with us a couple weeks ago, and we had a luncheon with my class, and they were asking questions about, you know, why aren't you a follower of Jesus? Why are you a Muslim? And that conversation was fascinating, and I guarantee that some of them thought, oh, I don't know the Muslim story very well, I need to learn more about it. But I also think he forced and asked a lot of our class, do you actually know your Bible well enough to have this conversation? And I think there were many people in our class, and Summer's in my class, and she's nodding away, that I think there was many people in our class that were like, I don't know if I was adequately ready for that kind of a conversation because I don't know if I know my own story well enough. So it provides an opportunity for personal ownership in one's own faith tradition. And this is from Bubble to Bridge. It creates space for understanding others, where they're coming from. It humanizes people to have these relationships. And then finally, it allows for commonalities, to be the catalyst for civic pluralism and unified action. So we recognize that as we honor one another's stories, we learn about each other, we recognize that there's a lot more we have in common than that separates us. We can come together around those commonalities, around our common hope for humanity, to do civic engagement in a very unified, beautiful way, where we can do good with one another as opposed to feeling we have to argue against one another. So I'm going to stop, and I'm going to let Ben come up and share a little bit of his personal faith story and how he's gotten to this point.
Cool. So like Jason said, I'm Ben. I'm a senior graphic design student here. As Jason was going through the stage of faith, I realized I'm just going to reiterate that in my own context, essentially. So I'll talk about my personal faith journey and how interfaith relationships have impacted that, and then how that found its way into my senior thesis in the art department. So I grew up in Richfield, Minnesota, not too far from here. Christian household, sort of like upper middle class. I had friends from similar backgrounds. Went to the Lutheran church, LCMS to be specific. Very traditional church. A lot of older couples. There was one other kid my age, so I wasn't super connected. to church, but I always went to Christian schools since preschool. And as I grew up, it wasn't until the end of high school I recognized that I was living in a bubble. I had friends at public schools, and I would hang out with them sometimes and hang out with some of the friends, and there was just a drastic difference between like what me and my friends were like and what them and their friends were like, and that was bad to me. It was very other and different. And I remember in high school, my freshman year in our scripture class, it's one of our units, like a Ken Ham creation course. And it was presented to me like the literal interpretation of Genesis as like, hey, here's how it is, here's the interpretation. Instead of like, hey, here's what some people think, but there's also these other sides to it. So my whole life I'd kind of been told how things were, and I don't think that was the intention of the people in my life, but I was never necessarily taught how to think as much. And so towards the end of high school, I started recognizing the inconsistencies in that. I was listening to like a lot of podcasts and sort of broadening the information I was taking in, and starting to look on my own. Then I came to Bethel, and that was sort of a relief, taking classic Christian Theo where all these issues are presented with multiple sides, and it was finally like, okay, maybe it's not about being right. Scholars have debated over these things for hundreds of years and no one's reached the same conclusion. Maybe it's just about being thoughtful and openly engaging with issues you aren't sure about. At the same time, my first few years here, I was learning a lot about what it meant to live in community. My freshman year was great, and I made a lot of really close friendships. And then sophomore year, I was a shift leader. And my shift partner and I were very sort of driven by just asking questions and like provoking thought and conversation. Neither of us like felt like we were like youth group leaders or whatever, and like trying to like teach freshmen how to be. We just wanted to have conversations because we felt like we're all kind of on the same plane. So sophomore year was really cool in that aspect, and then towards the end of the year I started becoming sort of frustrated that I'd never taken steps to get outside of the bubble that I lived in. And I started noticing inconsistencies within even the Bethel community. Like some people I'd see at Vespers on Sunday nights raising their hands in worship or partying the night before. And that was sort of a legalism that had been instilled in me. But I was frustrated with that, and like, how can this be when people are claiming one thing and living the other? So I just needed to get away from that, and so I studied abroad the fall of my junior year. I decided pretty quick at the end of the sophomore year that I was going to do that. So I went to Australia, which is a pretty westernized culture, but the university I was at was the majority of international students, so I met people from all over the world. And just to preface studying abroad, like, I don't mean to say you need to study abroad to have like important experiences. I think it tends to be romanticized, and like all you see is like social media highlights. There's a lot of challenges to studying abroad as well, and it was an important experience for me. So Australia, I met a ton of people. I remember orientation week, I did like a campus tour, and after the tour I was in a group with a bunch of guys, and there was a cafe down the street. We're like, hey, we should go get coffee. I remember sitting down, and across the table from me there were two guys from Germany, there's a guy from Pakistan, a guy from France, a guy from India, and then a guy from Georgia next to me. And I was just looking around like, I would never have imagined I would be in this situation, and hearing different people's stories, like this guy from Pakistan was doing a master's program in Australia, and his entire, both the way he saw himself and the way his culture saw his worth was his academic performance. And for me, I've taken my academic experiences totally for granted. I felt like I don't often have to try that hard or not done my best work, but this guy, like, his worth was wrapped up in that. And just like seeing different perspectives that I would never have pictured was super impactful for me. And also just like seeing people from around the world where previously this country had been like a story or a stereotype for me, and now it was this person sitting in front of me. And not to generalize like a whole country to like one person's experience, but that was super real for me. And one of my best friends from high school is from South Korea, and 2 years ago he just finished his mandatory military service. So 2 years ago he was like drafted for that, and like the Korean conflict for me has been like just something in the media. Obviously I know it's real, but it hasn't been real for me. And hearing my friend talk and like saying that like people are scared, you know, in Korea. that made that real for me because one of my best friends was over there like experiencing that. So yeah, studying abroad was awesome. I chose not to do a Bethel program because I wanted to be on my own in a place where I didn't know anyone, which as an introvert was terrifying. But it was super impactful to me to meet people like that. And I learned, and I'm still unlearning, the ways I've been conditioned to see people as other just because they're outside of what I think. And sit down and see their experiences, their stories, and how that, how the way they actually are, instead of the way my subconscious perceptions or assumptions would lead me to believe like they're a certain way, which is super flawed. And then coming back from Australia, the place I work now, I work with one other Christian, I work with some people who are just indifferent, and then I work with some people who hate religion. And I had some really interesting conversations about like, what is speaking in tongues, and like, what do I actually think about that has been like an interesting thing to deal with. I also work with some people in the LGBTQ community, and I'd never known like people in that community beforehand. And so to hear people talk about like the hurt they've experienced from the church, like one of my friends' coworkers after Easter was telling me like this was the first year his family did try to force him to go to church with them. And so there's a lot of hurt, and I previously had just kind of not considered like the ways the church does that. So yeah, overall I've just been learning to kind of sit in the discomfort of being faced with things that are contrary to me or what I've believed, and also the discomfort of maybe not having answers or knowing what to say in certain situations. So then this fall, for my senior thesis, we had to make a bunch of work and sort of relate a concept we were interested in or something we were thinking about to that work. So obviously this was still stuff I was processing. And throughout this I was sort of asking like, what is art and how should it be used to engage with people? I think before I ever took any art classes, I just thought it was decorative and stuff you put on the walls in your home. But I think art has a way of speaking to the human experience that words often don't. So now I'll just show what I came up with. I have two pieces to my thesis. The first is sort of the ways I have viewed other people. This is a projection that in a gallery would be big on a wall. But what I did is took about 60 portraits of people in the Bethel community, both people I know, people I don't know. I tried to be pretty inclusive, and then I blurred them, and they cycle through at an inconsistent rate to kind of simulate the way my perceptions or snap judgments or assumptions like often guide how I see people, which is obviously very flawed. Because all you can see is sort of an imperfect picture of who a person actually is when you allow that to happen. And I still am trying to actively recognize when I do that and fight against that. So that's the first part. The second part is sort of how I perceive myself. I think I often let insecurities or fears I have about how I'm perceived sort of guide the way I think about my identity. So things like being unapproachable. Like if I'm working on something, I often look very serious. And for people who don't know me that well, probably think like I'm unapproachable. Obviously that's just like an insecurity I have. But so what I did is took photos of myself, and at the back of the frame, it's an unblurred picture of me, and then I've written those words to kind of cover up that and simulate like how my identity is often skewed by the ways I see myself. So yeah, that's what I got.
Yeah. I think that's all we got. So I think one of the things like I said before, I really appreciate about Ben's art is that it kind of, again, where words kind of start to fall short about who we are, it puts definition to it. It's such a creative way of looking at who we are as people. But then I loved that scrolling image of how we view others, and I didn't know about the timing piece until we sat down to talk about this, but that sometimes we give people a little bit of a longer look than others. And I thought that was such an interesting way of engaging, especially people from other faith traditions. How much of a look, how much are we going to get to know, how deep of a story are we going to explore with that person? So I just loved his work, and yeah, I'm excited for you're becoming an awesome person, and I'm excited for you to graduate and see what comes next for you. So yeah, any questions before? I think we had a minute or two.
I had kind of just a comment. I was interested when you're talking about the continuum of kind of connection and crisis, how similar that is to a artistic process, and how it feels like this constant cycle of like, you know, doing the thing, is it right, is it wrong, and like this. And I didn't know, maybe Ben, if you could speak to that.
Yeah, totally. I think what I've learned, especially through my classes and stuff, is you just have to face it. Like, if you just hold your thing so close to your heart and don't do anything with it, you won't go anywhere. Like in my classes, like we have critiques, which are brutal and something I've never experienced. Like you put your work up on the wall, and then you talk about what's good and what's bad, and that's like that breaks down a lot of walls, just in like art and making, but also relates to faith. Like you have to be challenging what you believe. If you hold it so close with closed fists and you think it's fragile, you're not going to go anywhere, and when you're challenged, you're just going to break. But if I think what I believe is true or mostly true, then I shouldn't be afraid of challenging it. So, yeah.
So did you say you're an art major?
I'm a graphic design major. Yep.
Okay. So were you a graphic design major when you went on this trip?
Yep.
Were you studying graphic design?
I was studying mostly gen eds and business classes, but I did take a photography class while I was there. So.
Was that interesting, the art aspect?
So the university I was at, it wasn't a liberal arts school. It was mostly like law and business and medicine. So I was kind of on the fringes of that, and the photography class I took was like very technical, like for newbies kind of, so it wasn't super art driven, I would say. But it was interesting. I did take a class about Aboriginal culture, and their art is a big part of their culture, and it's all over the school, their art. So that was another experience, like learning about what they've gone through. It was just something I would never think of. I do have a story about that. I was in one city in Australia, and it was a city that has a larger population of Aboriginal people, and I was walking down the street with one of my friends, and this white guy comes up and he starts talking to us because he recognized our accents. He was Australian, but we were Americans, obviously. And he said, "What do you think about the Aboriginal people?" And I said, "You know, I've learned a lot about them, and I really feel for their culture, and have enjoyed meeting the ones I've met." And he said, "Well, you should take some of them back with you, because they're stealing our jobs, or taking our, like the government's giving them money." And I was like, how can you think that, like, if you've known what they've gone through, you know? So, yeah. I don't know if that's not an answer to the question.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to know how it influenced that part of you.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.